of Assessment, Cambridge University, Press and Assessment. Dr. Irenka oversees all research and development activity at the Cambridge Center for Evaluation and Monitoring, and she holds a first degree in natural sciences and a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge. With over 100 journal and conference publications, Irenka joined CEM in 2021 from Cambridge University Press and Assessments Group-wide Research Division. For many years, Irenka led research programs to evaluate, reform, and develop assessments, and her previous team also focused on making test development processes more reliable and robust. With over 20 years research experience, Irenka enjoys working with students, teachers, and other educationals to understand how to best support them in equitable and engaging assessments. She's fascinated by the question of what contributes to a student's success in education, and we are excited to hear all of the wisdom that she has to share with us today. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Can you see my screen? Can you see my slides at this point? Yes, you can see my slides? I can't hear you at the moment, Abdul.
I'm sorry. Yes, we can see your slides. I'm sorry.
You can see my slides. Oh, great.
Yes.
I can't see my slides, but I think I've found a way to do it. So yes, I was fascinated by Sharon's talk about teacher well-being, because I'm now going to talk about student well-being, because that's my area of interest, and I've titled this "What is Well-being from Antiquity to Education?" So there are three key questions that I'd like to focus on today. The first is simply, what is psychological well-being? The second is, why is well-being in schools such an important issue? And then thirdly, why is well-being worth evaluating or assessing? So firstly, what is psychological well-being? Well, researchers in different fields, sociologists, philosophers, economists, might well define well-being differently to how I do. My background's in psychology, so I'm going to focus upon psychological or mental well-being. And I like to take a well-being for all perspective, which lies in the burgeoning positive psychology movement. So I'm not focusing on the well-being of specific vulnerable groups. My focus here is not on medical diagnoses of mental health conditions. It's about the well-being of all young people. In the 1950s, the psychologist Abraham Maslow coined the term positive psychology, and various thinkers then took up this idea. And then at the turn of this century, the renowned psychologist Martin Seligman famously called for psychology not just to be pathologically focused, and he went on to set out a manifesto for positive psychology. He and Csikszentmihalyi wrote, "The aim of positive psychology is to begin to catalyse a change in the focus of psychology from preoccupation only with repairing the worst things in life to also building positive qualities." So this is about studying what is right about people in addition to what is wrong. And it's also worth noting as well that well-being can be quite context specific. People can feel well in one context of their lives, but not in another. So I'd like to add here that I'm thinking about well-being in relation to schools rather than in relation to all areas of a child's life, though of course they do interact. So I'd like to offer this very simple definition of psychological well-being, or mental well-being in schools, which was developed by my colleague here in Cambridge, Ros McClellan. She's in the Faculty of Education here. So well-being in schools is about how individuals both feel and function in the context of education. And this definition relates to this model of individual psychological well-being that Ros developed, and is underpinned by extensive empirical research that brings together two long-standing bodies of well-being theory on feelings and on functioning. So one body of research focuses on how individuals feel in their lives, and this kind of well-being is a combination of an individual's life satisfaction, so how satisfied they are with their life overall from their own subjective point of view, and also their experience of both positive and negative emotions, and the absence of negative emotions is very important. And it's about recognising and managing all of these emotions. You may have come across Ed Diener's work on subjective well-being, and that's where that would come in. And then the other body of research focuses on how individuals function in their lives. And this kind of well-being is a combination of perceived competence in what we do and interpersonal relationships. And it's nurtured through commitment to personal development, through engagement in meaningful activities, and also through connectedness with others. So it's about learning to accept who we are and what we could be to be fulfilled. And functioning well-being is understood by researchers to be really historically important in many East Asian cultures. And if you think of the work like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which puts self-actualization at the top, that would be on the functioning side here, or Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, or Csikszentmihalyi's famous theory of flow. You know that feeling when you're doing something you absolutely love, which could be playing a musical instrument, it could be gardening, it could be solving pure maths problems, it could be playing chess, and the time just whizzes by and you think, oh my goodness, where has the time gone? I was just so immersed. That was so fulfilling for me. I was really doing what I love. That's that feeling of flow, and that would be on the functioning side of the model. And as we have Greek hosts, I thought I would just touch a bit on antiquity, because there were two contrasting schools of thought in ancient Greece around what constituted the good life, which actually fit this model of well-being very well. Aristippus of Cyrene posited that pleasure is the sole good in life, so well-being is equated with hedonism. And then in contrast to that, Aristotle identified eudaimonia, or activity expressing virtue, as an ethical theory for living. And contemporary philosophers have interpreted Aristotle's conceptualization of living well as self-realization and personal effectiveness. So you could say that well-being has a very long history. I think perhaps one of the most important things to remember about psychological well-being is that it's subjective. It's a subjective psychological state, and that means that it changes. It changes from over time. It changes from context to context. So it could change from month to month, from week to week, or even from day to day. And that's really, really important to remember. And because well-being is a psychological state, two children in identical circumstances, same physical circumstances, might actually experience very different levels of well-being. So one child might feel happier or might feel more fulfilled than the other. And this means that if we want to understand well-being, we can't just look at physical health or welfare measures, such as being well-dressed, having enough to eat, and being able to afford to attend school or even go on school trips. Those things are very, very important, but they can't really capture psychological well-being. Instead, I think if we want to find out about well-being, in addition to looking at all of those variables, we need to ask children about their well-being and how they feel directly, if they're old enough to be asked. So now my second question I'd like to talk about is why well-being is just so important in schools. And I think that there are three key reasons why we should take this really seriously. The first reason is simply that well-being, I think, has an intrinsic value. It's got value in its own right. We want our children to be happy in school and to feel that they're doing well, given how many hours that they spend in school. There's this really famous book called 15,000 Hours, written by the late Professor Mike Rutter in England, and it's called 15,000 Hours because that's how long children spend typically in school. That's a huge amount of time, isn't it? And those of us who are parents or teachers or who know children in other contexts, we want our young people to feel safe and valued and to be excited by things during most of their waking hours, regardless of how they do academically. And that's just the same as what we want for ourselves in the workplaces or at home, or as teachers, for example. And all the teachers that I've known and worked with care very much about whether the children that they're teaching are okay or not. We want there to be that culture of care in our schools where we look out for one another and treat each other well. Excuse me. The second reason why well-being is so important is that a good education is about much more than cognitive development. I think it's about developing life competencies, or so-called 21st century skills. It's about having strong social, moral, ethical values, and it's about having high mental well-being. And of course, looking at the bigger picture like this is usually called taking a holistic view of educational success, a holistic view. And according to OECD, nurturing all aspects of a student's growth and thinking about how to work towards all of these outcomes in school, acknowledges those broader social and societal and economic responsibilities of education. And while today in many countries we're taking a holistic view, it's not actually a new idea. Pedagogical philosophies such as Bildung in Germany and Scandinavia centre around a holistic educational ideal that can be traced back many centuries. And the wonderful thing about taking a holistic view of educational success, including wellbeing, is that it can mean different things to different schools. I think I would suggest that each school around the world is unique, embedded within different cultures, different local and national laws and philosophies, different legal frameworks. So each school is serving a slightly different community in a different context, a slightly different population of students. And so the holistic educational offer will necessarily be slightly different in different schools, and wellbeing ideals and needs and how we really understand wellbeing and what we emphasize most will vary across schools. In my country, in England, wellbeing is part of the national curriculum. The UK government's recognised that social and emotional development are critical to success in later life, as they're a key and they're therefore a key part of the holistic curriculum. And it's also the case in many other countries as well. So Delhi, for example, has a happiness curriculum. I think our future generations of leaders, professional workers and parents need to be emotionally literate. They need to be sensitive and aware of the emotions of others. Third reason why I think wellbeing is so important is that it is actually linked with academic success. The evidence is now starting to emerge for that. Researchers at Oxford University in England reviewed about 10 years worth of literature on research literature on wellbeing from a range of different countries around the world, and they found quite convincing evidence of a relationship between wellbeing and academic attainment and other educational outcomes too. Research studies in the UK and in the USA have, and amongst other countries as well, have demonstrated not only that there's a link between well-being and academic performance when you assess the two at the same moment in time, or close enough, but there's also a link when you assess academic performance 2 years after you've assessed well-being. Why might this be the case? Well, recent research has shown, for instance, that better well-being is associated with more adaptive forms of motivation, so students wanting to learn and progress rather than avoiding learning situations. And well-being is also seems to be linked with engagement as well. For example, in the UK, an influential annual survey of well-being revealed that children with lower levels of well-being were more likely to truant, to skip school. And that's a correlation rather than a causative relationship, but still there, it's a possible reason. So now I'd like to move on to my third question. Why is well-being worth evaluating or assessing? I think the answer to this question is perhaps the same as the answer to that of why we should assess anything. If you can measure or assess something, then you can get better information about it, and so you can increase your understanding of it. And I think that this is true of well-being. As we've discussed, well-being is a psychological state that can change over time. So assessing well-being means that you have some understanding of whether students are mentally ready to learn and how that's changing. And also you're better equipped to try to improve well-being. You know which areas of well-being are higher, which areas of well-being are lower, how they vary among different groups in your school, perhaps girls versus boys or children from a particular geographical area. And then you can focus on improving those areas of well-being that are lower. And this is essentially the idea of formative assessment. I think there are lots of different methods for evaluating and assessing well-being. And I think there are potentially at least 4 different uses of assessments. Firstly, I think some assessments can be used very sensitively and carefully within wellbeing lessons to teach and explore wellbeing with students by helping them to understand wellbeing and by giving them a language to talk about wellbeing. I think we're giving young people tools to support high levels of personal wellbeing in the future. They see the kind of questions that you might ask to ask someone how they're feeling, and that's so important in adult life. Secondly, I think assessments can be used to evaluate and understand the wellbeing of groups of students. It could be classes, your year groups, or whole schools. And this can be a starting point for developing a school wellbeing strategy, deciding on which groups of students or which areas of wellbeing to prioritise, because we all have limited resources. And then assessments or evaluations can be used to understand individual students' wellbeing levels as well. Teachers can pick up on low levels of wellbeing in one or more area and then follow those up with the particular learner, the particular student, and access extra pastoral support if that could be needed. And of course, what's available there will vary from school to school. And then finally, last but not least, evaluations and assessments of wellbeing can be used to review and evaluate the impact of interventions to improve wellbeing. This can be on a large scale research context, but it could also just be within a smaller situation like a school. There are so many different suggestions for how to improve wellbeing. What works? We could assess wellbeing, try something new, and then see if it's made a difference by assessing again. As educators, I think there are many things that we can't control, but we can look at the things that are within our remit, and we need to consider whether our school policies and practices are doing all that they can to support everyone in school. And I think a whole school approach that covers teachers as well as young people and students and everybody else in the school ecosystem, or the immediate one, is almost certainly needed to really support wellbeing. And I just wanted to mention that there's a guide that's freely available on the UK government's website. It was originally intended for UK schools, but it's freely available to everyone, and it contains some good advice for school leaders. And you can simply visit gov.uk, and search for this title, and hopefully you'll find it there. And a whole school approach is a wonderful aspiration, but I appreciate it's not possible for everyone, or at the very least it could take quite some time to implement. And whether or not you manage to achieve this, I think individual teachers can identify strategies or activities that they can do to improve wellbeing in their class in many areas. My background's in research, so I'd like to end with one thing that research from UCL, University College London in the UK, indicates that teachers could do to improve wellbeing, and that is to make sure that each child has formed at least one strong professional relationship, a strong professional supportive relationship with a teacher. It's been found to be particularly important for the more vulnerable children. Children with at least one good relationship typically go on to perform better academically than children who do not have such a relationship with a teacher, in England at least, and I suspect in other countries as well. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of that wisdom, Dr. Suto. And all of you who may have questions for her, please feel free to add them to the Q&A and we will get them addressed. And I want to jump back and address Dr. Sharon Wolf's presentation. There were a few questions that came in, so I want to go ahead and get those questions asked so that we can have her answer them for you. And the first question is, why don't we use well-being courses in teaching university programs?
Well, I think this can also be relevant to Dr. Suto's presentation around how we also think about supporting teachers to support students. And I had responded to some of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but I do think there are growing efforts. They're unfortunately not systematic and widespread, but there are growing efforts to really integrate mindfulness and training for teachers as part of professional development. So it's happening in some places on small scales, but I think thinking of it more broadly in teacher training efforts is a really fabulous idea. Thanks for raising it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the next question is, doesn't more CPD affect our workload? So sometimes the person who submitted this question says that they feel exhausted to attend another professional development course throughout the year. And I hear that a lot from teachers, that there's just so much learning to be done in addition to the work that they have to do teaching.
Yeah.
So.
And that's also a big problem, is that often every year it's something new, right? So last year we were trained on this, you're supposed to do this. This year it's a new program, new approach, new curricula. And I think that's the problem. And one of the points I was trying to make around really getting teachers' voices into what do they actually need to make their work, to have these actually make their work easier and not harder, not extra work, but actually to align with the things they're already trying to do. And actually there's some really interesting research that shows teachers really need 2 years of ongoing training in a particular program to really be able to integrate it and use it in a way that's useful for them. So this switching from one thing to the next each year it's not helpful, right? And so much of the professional development is not designed to, it's supposed to be designed to make teachers' lives easier, but it's not actually with teachers' voices at the center. So I think good professional development is different than kind of the general. We need to kind of distinguish between those.
Got it. Another question is, a lot of teachers suffer health problems due to stress. And so how do you recommend dealing directly with those teachers that are suffering? And I know you gave some examples a little bit earlier, but are there any takeaways that you could give right now to any teachers that may be listening as to how they can deal with problems related to stress?
Yeah, so much of them are stemming from systematic problems, and issues that teachers can't control. So it's almost not fair to ask teachers to have to deal with them. But there are things that at the individual level you can do to manage the stress that's coming your way, right? Which I think is part of why some professional development programs are integrating mindfulness and meditation as part of teaching. But I agree, and actually there was another question by a school leader around how do school leaders assess teachers' well-being and stress, and there are lots of measures out there that are publicly available. School leaders can help with some of the systemic issues, but not all, because some of them are bigger than the school itself, many of them. But really, maybe giving those measures to teachers, right? And seeing how are they doing at the start of the year? How are they doing in the middle of the year? And if you're starting to see, let's say, increases in stress and how teachers are rating these scales that have been already validated, maybe that's a time to really talk to teachers and have a conversation where that is the center of the conversation, right? So it's, maybe it's not just for researchers and policymakers, my point around measuring well-being, but actually even school leaders can think about using that.
Great answer. And I know we're talking about well-being and we look at it holistically. We've talked a lot about, things that are related to stress, etc. And when you look at that, and teachers in particular, I know that finances and financial matters is a crucial aspect that also requires attention and is directly connected to educators and what's important to them. Can you share a little bit more about that?
That's one of those bigger systemic issues that, teachers and school leaders can't always solve themselves. It falls, I think, into the need to really, as a society, put teachers as really a top-ranking job in terms of how we pay and compensate, in terms of the importance of what they do, and in terms of how it affects our society and our well-being. But it's true in many of the places that I have worked, teachers are often working a second or third job because their salary is actually not enough. And this is true in early childhood education in the US as well. Many teachers are earning a poverty wage. Their wages don't have them, leave them below the federal poverty line. So that is a massive issue, and I wish I had a good solution for it, but that takes much higher level changes that I think we really need.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all your knowledge, Wolf. And with that, we will move on to some questions that came in for Dr. Suto, starting with the first question is more of a statement, but also a question in there. We can unpack that. there seems to be a big disconnect between the policymakers and the teachers implementing the policies. And this disconnect can be attributed to the fact that policymakers have never spent a day as teachers in the classroom to understand all of the changes and challenges that are faced. Is there anything based on your research, your findings, and your insight that you can share to help address those challenges?
So the challenge that policy makers are disconnected from teachers. That's a big question, isn't it? I think that's going to vary from country to country, possibly what the solutions are. There are policymakers in England who will listen to the research. So if the research involves teacher views, then they will listen to it that way. So that's one way that research could. I'm going to an event of that kind this weekend in Oxford, for example. So I know that research will be used and taken on board by policy makers that way. But that's not possible everywhere. Some governments run stakeholder forums, and they they produce papers, consultation papers that members of the public can consult on and share their views on. So that's another way that teachers can get their views across in England. But I'm not sure about all countries whether that's possible. I think sometimes as well teachers can invite influential people into their schools. Come and see what we do. Come and see what the pressures are. And there are researchers and also policymakers who are up for doing that.
Great, it is a big undertaking. And another question that came in relates to the preparation of students. So are we preparing students not just for exams, but also to be resilient, balanced, and purposeful, and to have that purposeful journey through education and beyond? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we certainly try to in England and in some of the international school contexts that I work in. My organisation is a department of the University of Cambridge, and we provide assessments for children and young people in England, but also in many international schools around the world. And I've visited a number of schools around the world. Earlier this year, I was in East Asia, in 4 countries there, where I went into schools to see what was going on. And I was impressed actually by the efforts that teachers went through sometimes through extracurricular activities. If there wasn't space on the taught curriculum to focus on some of these things, the extracurricular and what goes on in the social setting of the school to try and nurture strong values and good interpersonal skills and some of those 21st century skills, those life competencies that we need to. I think there is a real problem. Perhaps the questioner is making this point that sometimes we focus very much on what's taught and what's certificated, what we get qualifications for and certificates and exams and progression to the next level, and we don't value enough some of those wider skills. But when you get to employment, when you get to looking for a job, and we look at job adverts, we want those people who are more well-rounded. And we all know colleagues, don't we, who are brilliant academically but don't have the social skills needed to support others or to get on well with colleagues. So I would say it's very important. Perhaps we could do more of that. In some countries, curricula have been reshaped to teach around life competencies rather than around the traditional school subjects. But my reading of the highest performers in terms of PISA data, for example, of different countries and jurisdictions, is that might not be the way forward, and that can compromise success in traditional school subjects like maths, English, history, and so on. So I'm a bit unsure about whether that's the right way to go.
Thank you for that. It makes a lot of sense. And with all that you do with assessments, a question came in about how often should we assess the well-being of students in school?
Depends on why we're assessing them. So if we want, if for example we are worried about a particular group of children, perhaps there's been a big change in the school, perhaps some key members of staff have left or moved to a new building, or there's been a horrendous event like a fire or something like that, you might want to assess quite frequently around that that event to see how people are doing, or if you've got students you're particularly concerned about and you want to follow up with them, then there'd be a call to assess quite frequently. If you have a new group of students at the start of the school year and you want to get a sense of well-being and to follow that group through the year, I might just suggest 2 or 3 times a year, something quite but less burdensome, I suppose, because I noticed there was another question in the chat about how do we fit in assessment alongside all the other things we can do. And if you've got that in your curriculum and you've got time to teach wellbeing and you can assess it there, then that's great. But if you don't, then you might be restricted to tutorial times or short sessions before and after school. And a key aspect to that as well is assessing in a short and efficient way, not having extremely long assessments that go on for a very long period of time.
Brilliant. That makes a lot of sense. You're really looking at both individual and group, and then assessing depending on the school and the environment. And what's interesting is you talked about certain situations that may come up inside of that particular school or organization that may trigger a need to do an assessment based on that. Excellent. Excellent. And then last question for you was national curriculum's pressure as much with academic exams. And we talked a little bit about this, you touched on this a little bit more, but how can we incorporate assessing the students' well-being into sort of the academia? And I know you talked about it at a higher level, but particularly on an individual level, maybe for the teachers, is there any sort of advice that you can give for an individual teacher to be able to easily implement that into their own curriculum or into their classroom?
Well, it depends on the on the age of the children and the type of assessment or evaluation that you're using. If you use a quick digital assessment, like in Cambridge, we developed a Cambridge wellbeing check, which was developed initially for research purposes and then for use more generally. That just takes about 15 or 20 minutes to do. So an assessment like that, it's well doable within one lesson on wellbeing. If you want to evaluate young children, for example, through observation using something like the Leuven scales, then that would require observation as part of observation of other things that children are learning during play-based education in early childcare settings, for example.
Great.
I can see another slide has come up now, so we might be able to.
Yes, it's time to move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much. And I continue to encourage all listeners to engage, ask questions as